In the turbulent world of today, if you ask an average Westerner, what do you cherish the most in your life? You will often get the answer, freedom. Many of us take freedom for granted, as if it is a natural thing to have when you are born. That is both a perk and curse living in a relatively free society. But the reality is, both for freedom and many other human rights, it is something that always must be protected. Otherwise, you might lose your freedom. In this episode, I will discuss the concept of slavery and its counterpart, freedom. The film 12 Years a Slave will be used as a filmic example to this discussion and worldview. Welcome to A Man in Chains and another episode of Film Magistery. Most people who are living in open and free societies often underestimate the importance of nurturing and taking care of keeping freedom on the highest pedestal available. But I will not discuss freedom in this episode, but focus on its antonym, and that is, you guessed right, slavery. What is slavery and what are its origins? Slavery is a state or condition in which certain individuals or groups of people own and completely control lives of other human beings. Slavery was known almost to all cultures, nations, and religions. It can be traced back to the earliest records, such as Code of Hammurabi, which is a Babylonian legal code of ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to about 1754 BC. The code is made up of 282 laws, from regulations to instructed punishments such as an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, which is the first known law of retaliation, so-called lex talionis. But the Code of Hammurabi addresses also slavery, and slaves are often mentioned throughout the whole code. For example, in law number 15, it states that if anyone take a male or female slave of the court, or a male or female slave of a freed man outside the city gates, he shall be put to death. The code divides the population into three distinct social classes: the Amelu, the Mushkenu, and the Ardu class. Initially, the Amelu were aristocrats who had full civil rights. Here belonged the royal line and king's court, the higher administrators and such. They had greater privileges and responsibilities, but also were accountable to heavier punishments for crimes. Over time, the term Amelu became just a courtesy title. Historians have a difficult time recognizing the Mushkenu. The term came to mean simply a beggar, but according to the Code of Hammurabi, it doesn't necessarily mean a poor person, but most likely a person without own land. Mushkenu were free, paid less offerings to gods, and paid smaller fees and penalties. The Ardu were slaves. Their masters provided cloth and food for them, and found them even slave girls for wives. Their children would automatically become slaves too. Ardu could also marry free women, and their children would be free too. These were the classes in the ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia, but they continued and evolved in other cultures and different times, including Sumerians, ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, ancient Greeks, Canaanites, Israelites, Persians, Romans, Nubians, and so on. However, there were always a master and slave class. Later, Vikings raided much of Europe and took the most slaves on the British Isles and in Eastern Europe. Ottomans took a lot of Christians as slaves while on their conquests on the European soil, but Christian nations of Europe took Muslims of Spain and the northern Africa as slaves too, and sold them on slave markets. The list goes on in many parts of the world. But Poland, for instance, abolished slavery already in the 15th century. Lithuania did the same in 1588. Russia kept slavery until 1723, the United Kingdom until 1833, Romania until 1864, Portugal until 1869. In the fabulous book Conquerors, How Portugal Forged the First Global Empire, written by Roger Crowley, we can read often about slaves captured both by Christians and Muslims during the 16th century. This is what is written about Lisbon and its new wealth under the rule of King Manuel I. The city was a swirl of color, a febrile gold rush of floating populations of many races and colors. There were gypsies and converted Jews, and black slaves who arrived in terrible conditions, piled up in the holds of ships, 25, 30 or 40 at a time, badly fed, shackled together back to back. New, luxurious crazes infected the city. Black household slaves became commonplace. In modern times, I would argue that the Nazi Germany held slaves inside their labor camps, so-called Arbeitslager, mostly Jews, the Roma, and Eastern Europeans. The Soviet Russia had similar installations called gulags until 1960. Many are not aware that slavery exists even today in 2017. Types of contemporary slavery are bonded labor, forced migrant labor, sexual slavery, child labor, and forced marriage. The International Labour Organization estimated that 21 million people were living as slaves in 2012. Sexual slavery or forced prostitution is often encountered in the United States, in Western Europe and in the Middle East, but also in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. It is estimated that 22% of slaves in 2012 were active in the sex industry. Many of us have heard and read a lot about the slavery in the United States, mostly through literature, pop culture, and movies. Who hasn't heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain? Who hasn't seen at least some parts of films like Amistad by Steven Spielberg, The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, and the dreadful Django Unchained by Tarantino? Other well-known films about slavery are Gladiator by Ridley Scott, Mandalay by Lars von Trier, and Spartacus by Stanley Kubrick. But let's take a moment and focus on slavery in the United States. Slavery existed in the early colonial times in British North America, and it was legal in all 13 colonies at the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. However, abolitionist laws were passed in most northern states, while southern states continued as slave societies. The importation of slaves was prohibited during the Jefferson administration in 1808, but it did not stop illegal activities nor domestic slave trade. First after the American Civil War, slavery was finally abolished in December 1865. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World between 1525 and 1866. 10.7 million survived the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Of these 10.7 million, only 388,000 disembarked in North America. The rest ended in the Caribbean and South America. Now let's personalize a little bit the story of American slavery. There was a man called Solomon Northup. He was a free-born African-American from New York. He was born in 1807 or 1808 as a son from a freed slave and free woman of color. He was a farmer and a professional violinist. As a reference to Mr. Northup's tragic life, I shall use a period drama from 2013 called 12 Years a Slave, which was also title of Northup's memoirs published in 1853, the same year he regained his freedom. In 1841, he was approached by two white men who offered him a short and profitable traveling musician's job.
Men of true talents are seemingly in short supply.
Thank you, sir.
If we could persuade you to accompany us as far as Washington, we could give you $1 for each day's services and $3 for every night plated out performances. In addition, we will provide sufficient pay for your return here to Saratoga 2 weeks from today.
Solomon accepted their offer, and they went to Washington, D.C. The next morning, he woke up and found himself in chains in a dark cellar.
Well, boy, how you feel now?
My name is Solomon Northup. I'm a free man, a resident of Saratoga, New York, the residence of my wife and children who are equally free, and you have no right whatsoever to detain me.
You're not any free
And
man.
I promise you upon my liberation, I will have satisfaction for this wrong.
Resolve this. Produce your papers. You're no free man. And you ain't from Saratoga. You're from Georgia. You ain't a free man. You're nothing but a Georgia runaway. You're just a runaway nigger from Georgia.
Solomon was a proud man who used to enjoy the fruits of his freedom, but overnight he became a slave, and initially he didn't know how to act under the new circumstances. The behavior of a slave was something his white masters taught him through beatings, whippings, and verbal abuse. However, being a proud man, and a man who once experienced the sweet taste of freedom, he sometimes fought back.
I thought I told you to commence to putting on clappers.
Yes, Master, I'm about it. These have all been replaced.
Well, and didn't I tell you to get a keg of nails?
And so I did.
So you did. God damn you, I thought you knowed something.
I did as instructed. If there's something wrong, it's wrong with the instruction.
You black bastard. You goddamn black bastard. Strip your clothes. Strip.
I will not.
You will not live to see another day, nigga. Help!
What does it matter? What does it matter?
Master Tibbies wants to whoop me for using the nails you gave me.
This ain't done by half. I will have flesh, and I will have all of it.
Do not stir.
But with resistance come consequences and punishment. Solomon was almost hanged by a tree, but he was saved by his owner Ford, who sold him to a grim and sadistic slave owner, Edwin Epps, played by Michael Fassbender. He's a kind of a guy who whips those slaves who gathered the least amount of cotton, or wakes his slaves up so that they can dance for him in the middle of the night. So no wonder Solomon is thinking about escaping, but alas, something always comes in the way. Meanwhile, Epps is continuing with being a sadistic prick, so one day he whips Patsy, a slave whom he also forces to sleep with. But Solomon acquaints a good Canadian, Bass, played by Brad Pitt. Bass is not a supporter of slavery, so Solomon convinces him to take his letter to Solomon's friends in New York. One day Solomon cannot believe his eyes. His friends come to rescue him, and so they bring him back home to his wife and his children. Solomon was held as a slave for 12 hard years in Louisiana. As I mentioned, he wrote a book, 12 Years a Slave, in 1853. He lectured on behalf of the abolitionist movement in the United States. So how come people are accepting slavery, apparently since the beginning of time? Why do we still have slavery, forced prostitution and bond labor? How come we haven't gotten further than this? It is unbelievable and absurd, and we should as humankind be ashamed of ourselves. And haven't we failed as a civilization in this regard?